All right, everybody, and we are live. Welcome to our S.P.A.R.K seat this Thursday. It's a beautiful day here in California. The sun is shining. I'm not sure how it is in Madison. I'm curious to hear what the weather's like on that side of the world, but I am so excited about this day's S.P.A.R.K seat, y'all. We have Justice Castaneda in the house, and he is a very, very important person in my life. He is like a brother to me. And it's a beautiful thing that he has finally gotten into the Facebook ether and joined us in our group. As always, this is a conversation. You know, everything about S.P.A.R.K, from the game to the leadership development, is about breaking bread and sharing stories and connecting and showing courageous leadership. And so, as always, we're going to have a conversation. And nothing is prepared, polished. This is just a real live experience and a chat about courageous leadership. And this is someone who is currently the executive director of a nonprofit in Madison, Wisconsin, called the Commonwealth Development. And he can tell you more about that. He embodies courageous leadership. He wears so many hats. Like, we've been connected since our grad school days at Stanford. And our friendship over the years has deepened and strengthened in ways that has made me a better leader. And I'm going to get emotional talking about this. So I'm going to turn a corner and just say, look, he has been by my side on this S.P.A.R.K journey since jump, since November 2016. We have been connecting every single month, and if not more than every month. And I'm so thrilled to finally introduce you to Justice Castaneda, educator, poet, activist, and we're all stronger. And but anybody who knows Justice walks away a little bit provoked, inspired, and energized in new and different ways. And so without further ado, welcome Justice to the S.P.A.R.K community.
All right, thank you.
All right. So, we've had a lot of experiences together. You've been a strategy partner with S.P.A.R.K, and we've talked for hours on end. You were with me in New Orleans when we presented the S.P.A.R.K app to folks. I've seen you shine as a leader in a number of ways. We've actually co-taught summer school together. We've talked about everything under the sun, from like philosophies on life to leadership philosophies. And you have a very unique perspective and on leadership that was informed by your experience in the military. And I wonder if that has informed what your definition of courageous leadership is and how you might define courageous leadership.
Yeah, so thank you. I appreciate, just opportunity to chat with you. So I always think about the idea of a plan, right? And the plan is nothing more than the most natural and normal point of deviation from any current trajectory. It's never really meant to be followed because the conditions under which the plan are made are always fluid and they're never the same. So by the time you're done with the plan, in essence, it's obsolete. And so, the idea is not to like dig in and defend and become dogmatic about whatever you came together about. It's about to have, the capacity for humility so that you can come in with your peers and your colleagues and the people who you trust and you love, and you can talk about how many, the ways that you were wrong and the things that you missed. And so when I think about leadership, one of the things I think that I learned a lot, again, the Marine Corps experience, it definitely influenced my thinking about organizational dynamics. And a lot of the concept of roundtable leadership is that everybody brings something to the table. And in essence, this idea that, people think about leaders as being the singular dominant. And I don't know that that's the case. I think a lot of times when everything hits the fan and when the pressure is high, you find out that the folks who you might otherwise have seen as being the embodiment of what we consider leadership are not always the people who actually are going to be prominent or going to be the most effective in those moments. And a lot of times it's the people who, are back there and they're just doing their role. They're always being conscious. They always have the capacity, again, for humility to come to that table to make sure that we can have open and honest dialogue. I think really the protection and the creation and sustainability of that necessary space for dissent and introspection, I think, is what are the hallmarks of a leader and what the hallmarks of leadership, right? And I get into this thing where I don't know that there is such thing as a leader. I think that all of us at different moments are asked to step up into the fore and display certain characteristics that allow us to take care of the folks that we're working with and to take care of the people who we care about and the people who we're in collegial space with. And I think in essence, that is what leadership is. So it's something that's much more fluid than a static concept.
Mm. That's
and I guess,
deep.
It's just kind of jumping on that. I think a long time ago, I think you and I were in this conversation, but this concept of privilege I think it's become very ubiquitous. Mm-hmm. And I think, just to kind of dissect that, it's like, well, what do we mean by it? And I kind of took that and was like, everybody has a poem and everybody has a price. And the trick and the treasure is to find that humility so that we can be honest about both. Mm. And I think in terms of leadership, I think that's, having that necessary space for introspection and dissection and examination, self-reflection. I think those things are so critical in those moments when, again, everything is hit the fan and our backs are on a canvas. And at that moment, we have these options. And it's like, if we can find the space to do those things, I think we are a lot more effective in those moments. And I think that is what is showing up or manifesting in what a lot of people would conventionally call leadership.
Mm. Whew. There were so many golden nuggets in there, Justice. And we talk about this a lot, especially the poem and the price, because every single day there's a poem and every single day there's a price. And every day we have choices. And I see you as a leader who makes choices to live and lead in integrity, to do, to walk the talk beyond like the cliche, but really like, I've seen you volunteered in my school for 2 years, living in that space of humility, serving young people and reminding me that kids can't work and understand new concepts if they have wet feet or empty stomachs. And this idea of like really pushing the envelope in very quiet ways you have always done in my life, sometimes louder than others, but like subtle. It started as with pupusas and you bringing food to young people at Elmhurst. And then it turned into classes, intervention classes, to get kids to learn things that were connected to what they care about. And I wonder, I know that at that time, there's so many things that I could do differently in terms of like bandwidth and capacity for leading courageously. And there's a lot of moments that I replay and think about, like, what could I have done better? How could I have listened better? How could I have shown more humility? How could I have really internalized the information I was receiving, especially from you. And so I think about especially trauma-informed practices and how necessary it is to lead with consciousness of what's actually at play in places like East Oakland and areas that are experiencing toxic stress. And you have some brilliant thoughts and feelings about that. And I'd love to hear if you'd make a connection to like a time when, you had to take a stand about something that required courage. And I see you doing this every day. Like you really don't live in a place of comfort, to my knowledge. Like you always are up on the edge and disrupting status quo, which I admire so much about you. But would you mind sharing a time, maybe whether it's at Elmhurst or a time with your experience working with young folks where you had to actually advocate in a way that required courageous leadership for you?
There's so talk about it loaded. There's a lot of things, and I think sometimes, well, if there was one moment that I had to pick out, I think there's been a few. I think that moment of humility, I think, is so necessary, and being honest in those moments, I think, is so critical. And I know that it's never the moment where people look at it and say, well, that's a spectacular thing. That thing was like phenomenal. What you did there was phenomenal. But like that struggle that you have with that, your inner dialogue and being honest in those spaces, I think is as telling or reflective of leadership as anything. But I think, I was in Boston. I worked for the government. I think for a lot of folks, Well, there's different philosophies about whether or not you can change things from inside or, whatever. And I was in a space where, it doesn't matter where, but, I was working for a government agency and I was kind of given, it was a good job. I was kind of safe. I was in a prominent position. I had a lot of flexibility. I think when we're in roles at work and in government spaces in particular, we having the capacity for creative endeavor so that we can shape our day and we can shape our work is such a privilege. And I was in a space like that where it was a lot of latitude. And I was kind of given an ultimatum. We had a new executive director that came in, and it was kind of like, you can cancel something. I was working on some racial justice, health equity initiative. And it was basically an ultimatum, like, if you want to stick around, you're going to have to, in essence, torpedo this work that all these really amazing folks, I'm talking about like salt of the earth, just very strong, like dynamic people, public health workers, EMT workers, folks who have been doing this work for many decades. Were there, and they kind of got this thing to a precipice, and I came in at the very end, and to kind of coordinate and facilitate this conversation, and I was kind of given this opportunity to stay in my role or to continue, to be there, but I was going to have to, in essence, contribute to the realignment, or redirection, destruction, however you want to put it, of this initiative and this amazing work. And I was in a very interesting space because, again, I had just kind of moved everything to Boston from the Bay Area. I was getting paid well. I didn't really have a plan B, and it was kind of like an abrupt, like make this decision. And I know that I was, I had a lot of privileges. That introspection is necessary because I don't have children, and I think about that a lot. Like, all right, so how do people deal with these same things when they do have kids, or they have a family or someone who's dependent on them to come home and feed them? But I didn't have any of those things, and so I chose. I ultimately said that wasn't something I was comfortable with in doing, and knowing that was meaning that there was, my tenure at this agency was, coming to an end, and it was going to be abrupt, and it was. And it kind of put me out there, but it was that moment where I'm like, all right, so like if I were to do this, and historically, people, you've known me for a while, but people who have been with me in different spaces, like you come into a space and you operate, and sometimes we say that we're working or that we represent a voice of an affinity group or a community or a conversation that we're part of or a group of people that we care about, and that's cool. But sometimes we're in that space, and what we're really doing is we're working out our own things, and there's pain that we're speaking from that is specific to us and to our experience, and that's cool too. And I just think it's really important that we're honest in those moments. So like, cool, so you came in here and you're working on behalf of these groups or this voice of these people, but what I really heard you doing is, this was really about you, about me. And so like, were you being honest in those moments? And I thought a lot about all these conversations that I had in grad school and in school and just the politics and in the space and the communities and all these things with different people and with students and everything. And I thought about who I was as a person. Like, if I were to stick around and just try and, do that, it would have totally been just about me and about my own convenience. And at the end of the day, I was just hustling in the first place. And I just wasn't comfortable with it. But it really, at that moment, it kind of put me into, I was kind of in the abyss or of the unknown. And I usually, I've always been really good about hedging my bets. I don't get too comfortable anywhere because I always I hate the idea of being stuck. And so putting myself out there and just saying, all right, so like, I'm going to do this. And, I think at that moment that ethical, your core, it matters. And I had to tap into that. And it was a difficult thing, but, I think it was the right thing. And I feel happy, I have a clear conscience about my role in that, so I feel good about that. And I think that having that clear conscience and being able to say that I was given this opportunity, I was presented with the fork in the road, and this is the way I went. I think that that's a privilege unto itself. So I think that's one thing. There's many other spaces where I've tried, but I also know that I'm full of conflict and contradiction. And I think a lot of times when I was supposed to be the strongest and be the best person is probably when I was at my lowest points. And I know there's a lot of things that, obviously I hope, with everybody, you get hindsight, just 2020. And there's a lot of things that I wish I could have done different. A few things I wish I would have said a little different. But such is life.
That's a powerful example of a big macro moment. I'm a believer that we all have, every day we're faced with integrity opportunities and crises. They're macro and they're micro. It's like, do I do this thing? And is it in line with my core values? Do I pretend? Do I look the other way? Like you said, you're full of contradictions. I'm full of contradictions. We all are as humans. I think we're all doing the best that we can with the tools and the strategies and the resources that we have. And we're flawed. And I appreciate your humility and your transparency and vulnerability about that, because it's not easy to look back on those forks in the road and to see it so clearly. So I appreciate your self-awareness there, and to also just acknowledge that those moments, I remember talking on the phone a lot during those times, and like they require so much of us, and we can't do them alone. We need community, we need support, we need folks to lean on, to remind us and hold up the mirror, like, you're going to get through this, and here's what I know to be true about you. And so I remember that time, and I think I'm a believer that when we act in alignment with our values and we get closer to who we're supposed to be, there's something that happens in our energy and in our experiences and the opportunities that come to us that kind of magnetize something different, And I wonder if it was a surprise that soon thereafter you had the opportunity to be the executive director and to have influence and kind of orchestrate some experiences that perhaps you had wished you perhaps had. And I'm curious to hear what it's been like to be ED and to have that unique perspective. Like, you lead outside of the box, and some of the stuff you've told me that you're doing at Commonwealth Development is really profound, hosting learning experiences and seminars and empowering others to build their leadership capacity. Supporting others to step up and take responsibility for what they care about, and surrounding yourself with a board or a community executives, other managers that are thought partners with you intentionally. And I just am so inspired by your strategy as a leader and how you really lead outside of the box. So could you tell us anything that you're proud of, or anything that you particularly, I know it's not easy to talk about ourselves, but I really want to shine on this example, because it really is, I'm a believer that once we have exposure to other ways of leading, then we feel empowered and inspired to lead differently. And so, if you could just share any thoughts and connections to anything that I just said, it'd be great to hear some of your current experience.
In different moments, I've been in positions where, I was in management and I always feel like we're always beholden to and it's interesting when you end up in a position, and this is military, this is in educational spaces, this is in academia, this is professionally, and now it's here in Madison. But we all, you critique management, or you critique the way that folks are operating when they're in positions of leadership or perceived leadership or perceived power. And but then when you end up in those positions, you find out that you're doing a lot of the same things and why they were doing them in the first place. And it's like, oh, okay, so this is why this happened. And but you also, there's this moment where again, that necessary space for introspection, because you realize that a lot of it, and I get, if there's something for a lot of people say, well, people do the best they can. And I think sometimes we conflate that with people do what's most convenient for themselves. And again, I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with either of those things, but let's just be honest about which one we're talking about. And stealing this from cat named Jeff Duncan Andrade's paper he wrote, but he captured someone else's stuff. But he was saying that, Aristotle, the unexamined life is not worth living, and Malcolm X's take on that is the examined life is painful. And I think the necessary introspection that, we need for the work that we do in general can be very painful. And sometimes it's not that we don't have the quote unquote bandwidth. It's that we don't really feel comfortable because it's going to be painful. And we're going to have to come out here and accept some things about ourselves and about who we are that, we don't like to fancy ourselves as being. So when you're thinking about, all right, so like in terms of management or organizational leadership, like what are the things that we do because it's extremely convenient? And so a lot of things in terms of workplace rights and labor rights that for management is just very convenient. It's like I'm in this position. Ultimately, I have this role. And at the end of the day, the buck stops with me. So it's much more convenient for me to have all these things in place. Whereas if you start creating that space for dissent and dialogue, it can be much more inconvenient as an executive director, but it can be much healthier for the organization as a whole. And so I think just to kind of bookend that little preamble, in all these spaces, I've been, hopefully I'm growing, hopefully I'm learning from my own experiences in these places. And when I come into these roles, I think for me, it's an imperative to actually, have that conversation with myself about, what are the things that I need to do to make this the place that I would like to say it is. And this organization unto itself is very special. The work we've been doing here, it predates me. I had a phenomenal predecessor who kind of set up a great foundation. And in terms of our work being centered around equitable economic development, healthy housing, and sustainable land use, all rooted in a foundational bedrock of racial justice and health equity. Just inviting people here in terms of our management, our staff, and to really talk about what that means in terms of our interactions with each other in the workplace. And so when you start thinking about things, and a lot of 501c3s, a lot of organizations in general, it's more common now because a lot of us don't know what it's like to not have these things. But the idea of at-will employment, meaning anyone can be fired for any reason at any time, that's more common now than I think it has been, with the erosion of organized labor. In many places, people don't think about that twice. And so where you end up, 501c3s in general, a lot of them have never been unionized, and a lot of private firms have never been. And so the idea that, anyone could come to work and on the same day that they come to work, not have a job at the end of the day. Well, I know, I've been on different ends of that. And so I realized that that's not a healthy, having people in fear and having people live in constant fear, even if it's latent, even if it's not like overt, like I'm afraid of a tiger in a corner, but like, but having these lurking anxieties, like what that's doing to our capacity for creative thinking and for empathy and for all the things that I think are necessary for the work that we do with people. It's like, all right, so let's start chipping away at those anxieties. So like, let's make a policy that no one, my big three is like sexual assault, sexual harassment, violence, or threat of violence, or theft or fraud. Like those things could warrant immediate termination. But aside from that, for things like insubordination, for things like being late, for things like, all these other things that somehow, a lot of times can be put into a very interesting space. I think that we can do a lot more as organizations. It's not always going to be the most convenient, but I think it's incumbent on us to create these policies so that people don't live in these little subtle micro fears every time they come to work. And so we've been doing a lot of work here. I've done a lot, what I call eroding the power of the executive. I think a lot of times in these organizations, when you think about who has influence, and sometimes it's represented in pay, but it's boards of directors or boards of investors, and then an executive, and then maybe a deputy. And there's kind of this thing, and I, just kind of without getting into it too much, it's like you go into the critical examination of gender and organizational structure, and you realize that these are very much residuals of hypermasculine space, which has never been very healthy for anybody. And I would say even men, maybe especially men. But again, different conversation. But so let's make this so it's a little bit more democratic in terms of how we're going to have representation from people who are doing work and making sure that those conduits are open. Again, not very convenient. There are moments even now where I'm like, man, it would have been a lot easier to not have said this all when I walked in, because as I start going and as we start moving and as we start trying to implement things and work on projects, et cetera, sometimes I understand how, the most efficient form of governance is a dictatorship, probably. Now, whether or not government should be effective or efficient, or the relationship between those two things, I think is important. I think people have been grappling with these things forever, but there are all these flaws. So maybe we don't need that type of efficiency. Maybe we need to be much more effective. And then it begs the question, like, effective at what? And when you think about this thing where we value human beings, we value each other's story, we value each other's poetry, we value the narrative that everybody brings here. There are no weeds in this garden here, right? And being honest about that, like, all right, cool. So let's come in here and we're going to slow it down a bit so that we can make sure that we're not sacrificing our core values in the name of efficiency.
I love it. Write it down. Never sacrifice core values in the name of efficiency. It sounds simple, but efficiency is, sorry, I'm trying to write and talk at the same time. I'm not that good at it. Efficiency is the driver for everybody with the pace of life these days and how fast things are moving, and how both of us probably have racked up 20 emails since we started talking. It's like, how do you get through it all? How do you respond and rather than react? And how do you value quality over quantity? And when we really are crystal clear on our core values and what we're really up to and the impact we want to make, it's just so clear to me that everything else fits into place the way it's supposed to. I appreciate so much how you talk about perceived blank. It's the perception. Everything is a perception of leadership, perception of authority, perception of influence, perception of control. Like, it's all a perception. And when we see it as that and realize people have to be in relationship in order to get to collaborate, people have to trust each other in order not to feel fear in their workplace, or vice versa, right? If we see that people have to know each other and have space to get to know each other, and that's not efficient. That's not nothing about the S.P.A.R.K way is like a silver bullet, fast approach. It's like depth versus breadth. And I just appreciate so much how much you really embody what it really means to do this work and to show that critical self-reflection, critical examination of the layers of what's at play. And not everybody leads that way. And I'm just so glad that this community gets to have a little glimpse into what it's like to work with you, because it's a gift. It's a gift to everyone who knows you, that you hold this critical lens. And it's never easy to hear. And that's, when someone gives you a critical reflection, it's not convenient, but that's the work of equity work. That's the work if we're really, really down and like committed to equity and to educational equity and to serving making sure that all young people get access to a quality education, then we have to be open to that critical reflection. We have to see it not as a threat, but we have to welcome it and expect it. And that's when the conversation and the experience begins to change. So thank you for sharing those examples and for really leading and living that story, erode the power of the executive. You do that. And it's a powerful thing to witness.
There's a more Marine stuff, but the there's a Marine recon thing, and I stole it from them. But the idea of slow is smooth and smooth is fast. And keeping that in mind, that you're not trying to be expedient or to be fast for fast sake. You want to make sure that you're in the process of doing any work that you're adhering or aligning to what you think, who you think you are in the morning, when you look in the mirror, etc. I also think, going back to that concept of that inner dialogue and that self-reflection and being honest and that humility to be honest. And And you've been there, but it's some I talk to youth about, some I talk to people about just in general. But, when we look at ourselves in the morning in the mirror and we say that this is the person that we are, like this is who we are and this is what we value. And then when you go at the end of the day and you look at yourself in the mirror again at night and you say, well, this is who I am and this is what I did. The question is, like, in that day, in terms of every interaction that you have with a person, every interaction you have with space, do you have enough evidence based on what you did and how you operated to prove yourself guilty of being the person that you said you were in that morning, right, when you woke up? And we all, would fancy ourselves to be a number of things, and we get all this present itself and et cetera, et cetera. But I think, and even our interactions working together at the middle school, it's like, all right, so like if we have to say things, sometimes the things that we got to say, it's like, all right, so am I saying this in a way, it's, this stuff is difficult, but am I going to say this in a way that, is this about me? Is this about me proving that I'm right about something and at the expense of everything else? Because that's ego and insecurity and a lot of these other things. And and I'm not even saying that that's wrong. I think there is room for that, right? That room for saying, you know what, I'm just going to take over at this moment. I'm just going to step in and I'm going to take this over because I know this and I got this. And there is some part of that in terms of confidence in that moment to step up and say, I'm going to take all that ego and I'm going to compress it and I'm just going to go. And be honest about it, though, right? And so, or are we really doing this for the benefit of the folks that we really care about? And knowing that, like, all right, cool, so I'm about to say this. We might not be friends afterwards. I'm going to say this and I'm going to bring this to the fold because I think it needs to be said. We may no longer be friends. And like at the end of the day, when we ever have a chance to look back on that moment, like the question that I always look back and ask myself is like, in that moment, was I doing this because I cared about A, B, C, X, Y, and Z, or was I doing that because I was trying to reify some compensation for my own insecurities or my own ego, right? And so these are things that, again, at the end of the day, it's not so much what we tell each other, it's about whether or not we can tell ourselves these things.
Yeah. No, that's a really important connection because a lot of folks in this group are committed to the work of racial equity and educational equity and care deeply about inclusion. And a lot of patterns in this group have come up around having difficult conversations is consistently something that keeps coming up. Courageous conversations, difficult conversations, conflict, when there is a lot at stake, crucial conversations, et cetera. And I think I appreciate that example because in something that I'll connect to is like, is this my ego talking? Like, is this about me or am I really trying to help the other person? And on the other side of that, coupled with that second question to me is always, can they hear it? Do they have the capacity to actually take in this information and do something differently as a result? And that's a key distinction because if we're really in the game of leading, if we're really in this work of actually committing to elevating others and leading and influencing others in service of our values and our missions, then I think the hard question that we have to ask ourselves is, am I in deep enough relationship with this person? And do I know them well enough to know that they are going to be able to hear this? Because ultimately, if they can't hear it and do something differently as a result, then what was it for? Then it was for us, right? In some ways, because I think I've had to constantly push myself to be like, what are my intentions in this moment? And is this about me? And is this about something I care about? Versus, is this something that they have the capacity to hear and do, actually walk away from this conversation doing something differently in service of kids, right? And that's something that I'll constantly have to think about. And we replay and rethink and rework we've had thousands of conversations over the years, but the one that constantly comes up for me is Carrot Day. It's like, do people have the emotional bandwidth, the capacity, given all they're going through personally, professionally, do they have the capacity to take in the information that's being offered? And we'll tell y'all the Carrot Day story on another day because we're getting close to time. But that one is a very key example of like, all right, when the carrots are flying and like the kids are, in the background and then texts are coming in and da 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 da, like, how do we show critical discernment and how do we show up with grace in those moments in offering and asking for what we need? It's not easy. And I'm by any means an expert in that arena, but it's something I'll always aspire to work on.
Yeah, and I think the hard part is that there's no answer to that. I mean, because the other question, I guess the duality there is, will they ever have? I mean, there's a number of things that are always pushed to the side because we don't have time today. We don't have the time to go at that. Matter of fact, we've never had time and we're never going to make time. And so you say in those moments that, all right, cool, well, you're never going to make time for this conversation. You're never for this because it's painful. And it's going to require you to rethink everything about who you are and the things that you assume, the things that you think are stuff that you earn, and really it's just stuff that you were endowed with. And you're never going to have the capacity to do that. You know what I'm saying? So you're never going to have that conversation. So you know what? I'm just going to break it. And it's not going to be comfortable and we're not going to be friends, and that's cool. But the thing is that there is no right answer, and it's so hard to know. Temporal space is such a hard thing to grapple with. And so we don't know that whether or not people are going to have those, but forever people have been saying, later on, we're going to deal with name the thing. And usually those things are the things that require that type of honest introspection and really self-examination. And people are never going to make the space for that. And so it's you're kind of out there, you're always having to negotiate that. Like, all right, so like, but, the other thing is that, like, and this is what I'm saying about who you are in that space, because it's like, cool. So if you really cared about, this name, the affinity group or the conversation, then you would have done this in this way because you would have invited people in. And instead you just came in there and you freaked everybody out and then they just rolled out and you lost that space. You lost that opportunity. And you got to balance that with, well, I don't think they ever would have jumped in anyway. Because, and it's always interesting about who's being asked to accommodate who. And so it's like, all right, so like if you're in excruciating, I always use, well, there's a number of horrible examples I could use, but like people in excruciating pain they're always the ones that I feel like we're asking to accommodate the needs of folks who are much more well off, and to make sure that the people who are okay have it's very convenient, that we're giving them easy entree, we're giving them necessary on-ramps and all these other accommodations that we got to make for folks so that they can be part of a conversation as to why an individual or group of people are in excruciating pain. And so, we run, but, like I said, this is the story with this. There is no right or wrong here. And it's what I mean about that unexamined life, not worth living, and the examined life is very difficult. And so there is no answer to this. It's just something that we're going to constantly have to grapple with. And that's what I think at the end of the day is the core about what we're talking about. That's right. It's not going to be fun. And sometimes it's going to smell bad, but we're going to go out here and we're going to do the best we can. And hopefully we have the humility so that we can come back the next day and tell the people that we love and that we care about the places where we were wrong and the places where we really just operated out of our shortcomings.
Yes. That's right. And you talk about temporal space. I'm not sure if everybody knows what that means. Do you want to just give a quick definition of what you mean by that?
Time space, temporal space, temporal dynamics. I mean, we have a hard time negotiating time. Operate on very interesting imperatives because of it. And it's very difficult, like there's no way to negotiate that. Like, oh, well, if X hadn't happened, then Y maybe would have happened a different way. I mean, there's no way to really know these things. And so it all becomes conjecture on some level. And so it's hard to make an assessment. I would say it's dangerous to make an assessment. And so I think a lot of the reason that people just kind of hang around and they kind of, they just kind of skirt through they wade instead of diving or jumping out is because you don't know what's going to, and you kind of want to just ride this thing out. And that's kind of, it's, I don't think it's irrational. I think we're saying, well, you know what? We're not going to, if we go extreme down one end, there is no way back. We're going to jump down a rabbit hole. Now we're down that rabbit hole. We're going to have to follow through. And maybe if we would just wait this thing out, I think again, without getting into a long discursive conversation about geopolitics, I think there's a lot of things that historically it's easier for us to just kind of wait it out.
Mm-hmm.
We don't want to jump in, because once you jump in,
right,
take a stand, you make a call here, you're going to be accountable to it. So we're just kind of in this. I mean, the graduate seminar, I would say, is ripe with this, where people just kind of, what? I hear what so-and-so is saying. I kind of support it. I don't really want to jump into it right now, though. I'm going to tell them after the class. I'm going to go up to them and be like, hey, man, I hear what you were saying. And, that's, I think, a very reductive metaphor to what we grapple with in these situations, right? So, like, how do I know whether or not that person will or won't deliberately create that bandwidth and that space to get involved in this conversation? I got to make it.
Exactly. That's the one thing I was going to push back on, because my mission is to make sure that I am supporting others to see the imperative, the equity imperative, to make space for this. And so when you said people will never make space for that type of discomfort, I felt some sort of way about it, because I'm like, when we talk in binaries, like always or never, then I've learned this from you, like, right? We actually make new perceptions and assumptions. And I think my biggest goal is to have spaces and to hold space. This is one of them. This is a space where there's space for dissent intentionally. There's space for divergent thinking in here. There's space for specifically having these conversations. And I think that's a start. I wish I would have done more 7 years ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, to create space for this and to assume that if you respect someone and if you trust someone, then and if they tell you, hey, Rachel, this is really important to me, I want to share some thoughts and connections about blank, blank, and blank. It's not going to be easy, but it's really critical. Then I need to pay attention, And I think the emotional bandwidth piece with kids is so critical. And people are starting to think about that more and more now with research about the brain and trauma-informed practices, et cetera. And with adults, I think not enough people are paying attention to, and this, you're the expert in the brain science, right? Like, what is actually happening in the brain when we're under distress or have constant kind of emotional crises on our plates, right? And I think that the challenge here that, we get to work together on, which is a beautiful gift, is what does it really require? How do we have to organize ourselves? How can we support more folks, adults and kids, to create space for this dissent, to show up with humility, to take the leap and stop waiting and like really be in community with each other and having other people's backs, sticking with them through those hard times and not giving up when things get hard, asking for space if you need it, but like coming back and saying, I'm still with you. And I heard you say that this was important to you. And so I'm never going to give up on this relationship. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, no, I do. I mean, like I said, I think it's so hard. Malcolm X, this is a great line, he's critiquing, you'll get the critique, but he says, there you are sitting there where they're tying the rope around your neck and you're saying, forgive them. They know not what they do. As long as they've been doing it, they're experts at it. They know what they're doing. And so there's this kind of, like I said, I think it's a necessary friction, because it's hard to know. And, and there's a lot of things that, like, the question is like, well, these things have been going on forever. And it's great that some, you know what I mean? Like, people, it doesn't ever seem to be the right time. And I think, like I said, it's a hard, these things are really hard. It's a really hard space. And, I think for us to deliberately engage in this stuff, it's a understanding that we're going to go into some spaces that are not going to be comfortable. And we're going to, and a lot of people, in my experience, have been like, we want to get involved in this conversation. We really want to talk about whether it's trauma-informed care, whether it's trauma-informed pedagogical practice, whether it's equity in the class, all these things. But we want to do it in a way that is going to be comfortable for me, that I can, in essence, reinforce my endowed privileges that I, have on birth, that I can go in and I can be reflective of the same power dynamics that exist in all these places, and that it's going to be really easy for me to understand, and where ultimately I can be the expert. And it's like, well, that's a lot. Those are heavy constraints to put up, and honest discussion. So But you know, I hear you. I mean, it's an ongoing challenge that we all. I think that's the work, right? That's
Yeah.
what work is about. Is that we're going to have to get into this conversation and we're going to have to do it. And I think, you know, going back to the idea of not compromising our own ethics and saying, you know, ultimately see people through their pain. And I'm a pacifist at the end of the day. I don't even believe in evil people. I think there are people who are in excruciating pain. I think some people are very sick. And I think some people have been educated in very troubling ways. But just kind of the war, you know, the military, I just won't see people as superfluous anymore. And I just have to accept the fact that there's just going to be some folks who are going to want to hurt me. And I have to love them anyway, right?
Mm. Well, that's a beautiful way to end this. That's a beautiful way to wrap it up. You know, this is this work never ends with some like perfect bow tied. You know, it's like, this is it. This is courageous leadership right here. This conversation and this relationship. I'm so blessed that I have you in my life and that we get to have these conversations on a regular basis. And you check me on a very consistent basis around like, all right, Rachel, you hold up the mirror. And I couldn't think of a bigger gift, you know, on this journey. Like, how much S.P.A.R.K has been informed by your leadership is profound. And I know you like to stay in the sidelines and not be in the spotlight as much. And so it means a lot to me that you came on in this space on live and had this conversation in public, because I want the world to see how amazing you are. You're a gift to the world, Justice.
Rachel.
Right on. All right, y'all. So for those of you who are watching the replay or you're watching this on YouTube, let us know what you think about this. What does it spark for you? What connections do you have? What questions do you have? If you want to learn more about what Justice is up to or the Commonwealth Development, it's over in Madison. Check out their website. He's doing amazing work. Also, spoken word, poetry, writing. He's a man who wears many hats. So if you're interested in seeing any of his work, just send us a message and we can send you more of what Justice is up to. But for now, we'll just put a pin in this conversation and have another conversation on another day. But thank you again, Justice. It's been a real powerful, powerful conversation. It's a gift.
All right. Likewise. You have a good one.
All right. Take care, y'all. Have a wonderful day. And as always, keep